Okay, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to introduce Dr. John Beale. John is an absolute expert in flourishing, specialising particularly in flow. John is an academic visiting fellow at St Antony's College, Oxford, and is also in charge of research at Sevenoaks School. So yeah, couldn't be happier to be speaking to John. We're going to cover a range of topics, focusing obviously on flourishing, how to support students to flourish, but we're also going to look at the future of education and how flourishing fits into that, because John's actually writing a book for the Oxford University Press on that. So really, really excited to hear more about that. John, thank you so much for joining us. Amazing to have you with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Very kind introduction.
John, please could we start with your understanding of flourishing? What's flourishing mean for you?
Okay, so I would define flourishing as a long-term way of being in which 4 key areas of your life are going well. Your relationships, work, or if you're not yet in work, education, let's say. Your personal development, so sort of personal goals you have for yourself that don't fit into, say, work or relationship areas, and your health. And that your kind of recognition of how well these areas are going in your life is actually calibrated with how well they're actually going. It's in line with the truth. So you're not, for example, deluded.
Yes.
How well your life's going in a certain way, it's actually not going that well, or let's say you had extremely low self-esteem, so you didn't think your work or education was going well, but actually it was. So to flourish, you need to add that into it. And that connects then with something else I think is important in accounts of flourishing, which is truth. I think to flourish, your fundamental beliefs need to be true, approximate to true, or at least aiming towards the truth. Fundamental beliefs I take to be those that have a significant practical effect on your life and slash your lives of others. You need to find your life meaningful, but again, that needs to be calibrated with how meaningful your life actually is. If you think your life's not very meaningful, but it actually is, then that's not necessarily a kind of a block flourishing, but it's an obstacle towards it. So, for example, Martin Seligman gives the example of Abraham Lincoln, who was extremely depressed throughout much of his life, obviously lived an extremely meaningful life. I also think that fulfillment is important for flourishing, but that has 2 aspects to it. So typically accounts of flourishing to be the fulfillment of potential, which I think must be included. But I think there's a second aspect of fulfillment in the sense of life satisfaction. I think when people say they're fulfilled, they typically mean that. So, for example, a feeling of contentment in how your life is. Now, that could include fulfillment of potential. That might be why you feel contented, but it need not. Okay, you could feel contentment, and actually you're not feeling potential, but because your life is just, you think, really good in all the respects I've mentioned, but maybe you could do a hell of a lot more. You're not quite feeling potential, but nonetheless you feel fulfilled. So there's a second aspect, I think, fulfillment in the sense of life satisfaction. Now, I haven't mentioned happiness there, because I would argue that happiness flows from all those areas. If your life is going well in those 4 key areas, you find your life meaningful, your recognition of these things are accurate, you feel fulfillment, it's extremely likely you're experiencing happiness. And I also have some reservations about where we place happiness in the account of flourishing, but I don't think we need to necessarily make it explicit that happiness is one of the constituents of flourishing. I think in that account, positive emotions such as happiness emerge. So that's how I would.
Fantastic. And would you say there's a hierarchy to those, or do you think they're equally important?
I would place, I would argue that meaningfulness is, I'm resistant to hierarchizing things too much, but I would argue that of those, the most important are good relationships. And again, your recognition of being good is accurate. So an example of that would be if you thought you were in a good relationship with actually an abusive relationship, but due to, say, gaslighting, you come to believe that it's your fault, the reason that there are any problems there, and actually it's a good relationship. That's an example of where your recognition of the facts is just out of sync. So relationships, meaningfulness, and fulfillment of those, I would argue, are fulfillment in that broader sense, are most important, and along with that, truth. I mean, I'm reluctant to hierarchize too much, but I think those are the most important areas.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Very well.
And I'm really curious, so given that, and it is very, very difficult to place a hierarchy on something as complex and stunning and beautiful as flourishing, how can we best support young people to flourish, would you say?
Okay, I should add that I've also missed one step that I should have mentioned as well in flourishing. You also have to be living a morally good life.
Yes.
I should have added that bit to it. I don't think you have to be living an extremely virtuous life. You don't have to be Gandhi, but you have to be living a morally good life, not even a bad. But I've got in there because I've been to some talks where someone might entertain the idea or even argue that evil people can flourish because they fulfill various criteria of flourishing. They might be fulfilling their potential.
Yes.
Depending on how you define that, they might have great life satisfaction, might be really happy. They might find their activities meaningful. And so therefore they're flourishing. No, I don't think we should. I think it's an absurd conclusion to reach if we say that deeply evil people are flourishing. So I think we need to add also morally good life to that. And sorry, that would also be one of the important areas adding to your hierarchy there. So how can we best support flourishing of students? Well, the most effective way to do this, and I think the big challenge that faces educators and researchers who are working on in this area, so trying to figure out what flourishing means in education, how it relates to education's aims, and how to practically embed it, is closely embedding education and aligning it with education's core aims. So something I'm particularly interested in is what's the relationship between, if you like, what are often regarded as, and typically regarded as the primary aim of education, epistemic aims. So developing knowledge and understanding and the virtues and skills that support gaining knowledge and understanding, such as critical thinking skills. How you can relate supporting flourishing to those, because in a lot of interventions in school, interventions being research exercise aiming to explore some area and test it, flourishing activities often sit on the periphery of an educational institution's concerns. So for example, you might do well-being exercise in co-curricular time or tutor time or after school, such as things like gratitude practices, which are very effective well-being, maybe some meditation, maybe some mindfulness, all of which are fantastic. But when anything is within the outside of the lesson time of school, it's immediately, or in most schools at least, seen as not as important as the stuff of the lessons, of course, right? I mean, the idea of a co-curricular program kind of aims to elevate that, right? So to balance things out. And of course, the students themselves often take co-curricular activities at least as seriously, if not more seriously, than, say, their academic pursuits. But within the fabric of a school, I think if you really want to support student flourishing, you need to find some way to integrate it with fulfilling the core aims of education. Now, fortunately, and kind of a way of kind of giving the support for an argument as to how you can do this, is that there's increasing research on the idea that learning and well-being are co-beneficial. In the sense that, well, learning enhances well-being depending on how you define well-being. If you define well-being in a very broad sense, and let's say you treat flourishing as synonymous with sort of holistic well-being, like for example the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard defined flourishing as complete human well-being, a state in which all aspects of personal life are good, right? If you define it like that, then learning is obviously going to support flourishing and well-being, because that will be part of what supports all aspects of your life being good, right? Fulfilling your potential, for example, developing character virtues, broadly construed to include things like cognitive skills, like critical thinking skills, but also other virtues that character education fosters. So learning will support well-being, but how does well-being support learning? There's growing research suggests it does support learning. I was interviewing a lady last night, she's done a lot of research, this Professor Lee Waters, who's Professor of Positive Psychology at the University of Melbourne. I interviewed her for a podcast on human flourishing, actually.
Put the link in there.
Yeah, please do. Talk more about that later, perhaps. And she's an expert on flourishing intervention in positive psychology in schools, and she draws upon research, a huge meta-analysis that provides an account that, drawing upon all the research, or a huge body of the research on the relationship between well-being and learning, studies show that by implementing well-being activities, at least in positive psychology in schools, that can enhance performance and tests by an average of 11%. Right? And that's one very wide example from a large meta-analysis. You can draw many other examples too, right? So one area that I work on, as you mentioned, is flow. So flow being the psychological state of optimum human performance and experience. And if you can get a person into flow, research suggests that their capacity for learning increases by 200 to 500%. Flow also significantly enhances well-being, which is why it's one of the criteria in the PERMA model of positive psychology as a major contributor to psychological well-being. So if you can, say, get students into a flow state when they're learning, which many students are, at least sometimes, then that directly enhances both their learning and their well-being. So what we need to do, so as it were, it doesn't need to be the case that you have, say, your lesson time of an hour and you have to reduce it by 5 or 10 minutes to have the students meditate or do a gratitude practice or do a what went well exercise to make them feel better, or go for a walk in nature, because that's kind of one of the objections that faces, right? Attempts to support flourishing schools, that how this is going to, if you're going to embed it, that's going to reduce core lesson time when they're learning mathematics or something, and that's problematic. I would argue you don't have to, by looking at the research on the ways in which well-being enhances learning, then trying to embed those. So it's something like flow, so the subject I teach, philosophy, if you can, and this is what I'm exploring in the moment in research, how we can facilitate group flow in the teaching of philosophy, say in discussion activities. Well, if you can do that, you don't change the content necessarily, you don't change the content at all of what you teach. You vary the teaching and learning exercises, and we can talk what that might involve in a moment. You don't take any of the time out of the lesson, you just enhance what you're trying to do in order to support learning and well-being. So I think the most effective way to support flourishing in schools is to have, you can have all the stuff on the periphery, all of the co-curricular activities on things like, on areas that research has shown do enhance well-being, such as time in nature, inspiring a sense of awe and wonder, gratitude exercises, time, fostering close social relationships and so on, physical health activities, and so on and so forth, all of which contribute to well-being, but also embed it within the core elements of the educational experience, which are lessons. And that's the big challenge I think that faces the future of research and flourishing, how we can best do that.
And what are you finding so far?
Well, so in the case of the flow exercise, so I'm in a very early stage of the research on that, so I'm still actually designing how I'm going to do that, and then next term I'm going to try this out as an intervention. Right? So in the case of that research project, there's research on flow up until I think about 15 years ago was focused largely, almost entirely on individual flow. When an individual gets into this state of complete immersion in an activity. So just to define flow in more detail, flow is, the paradigm example of flow is when you're kind of in the zone. The sports plays in the zone, and it has certain criteria to it that enable you to identify it as you being in a flow state, such as a loss of self. You're not kind of thinking about what you're doing, you're just merging with the thing you're doing. You're just one with the activity. You're not really kind of thinking about, say, how do you coordinate yourself if you're playing a sport. You're just doing the thing, lost in it. Second is a kind of a time dilation, a loss of the sense of time. That's not a necessary condition for flow, but a very common indicator when you lose track of time doing something. That you're like, how long have I been doing this? The hours have just passed by. It's not a necessary condition, because you can imagine like a chess player is in deep flow, but they're keeping an eye on the clock all the time, right? But they're deep in flow, right? But it's a very common indicator. And in positive psychology, when they do surveys, whether you're in flow, they ask you questions such as, did time stop for you? Did you lose track of time? A third is that you have a kind of a very wide view of insight over things. So you just have insightfulness over a whole area. It's sometimes called like the watchtower effect, where you can just see everything in a kind of very clear, salient way in front of you. You just are very clear on things. Now, and there's various other conditions too. Now, that was research in flow for a long time was on individual flow. Then Keith Sawyer started working under Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the so-called father of flow, was his PhD student. And Keith Sawyer was a jazz musician and academic, and he observed that the jazz musicians, they seem to be deep in this flow state, but collectively, like when the jazz pianist or the drummer or the bassist or the saxophonist, trumpeter is just ripping some solo, and everyone's in the space behind, they can see where the soloist's going, and the drummer starts to support them, and they're all collectively moving to this state. It's like those guys are in group flow, right? They're in a flow state together. Or a sports team that are just really absolutely smashing it together, and they're just on top form, and everyone's equally contributing towards this collective state, and they just can't mess up. He said, okay, maybe there's something called group flow here. And he's done a lot of research on that in the last, I think it's about the last 15 years. He has an excellent book called Group Genius on this. And I'm exploring how we can facilitate group flow in the teaching of philosophy.
Yeah.
Philosophy is, so much of philosophy, the teaching of philosophy is discussion-based. Discussion is the lifeblood of philosophy, right? So obviously it involves individual exercises like writing essays, other written exercises, presentations and so on, but a lot of it is discussion-based activities. My kind of key question I'm asking is, how can I facilitate group flow in those kind of discussions in such a way that a group of individuals get into a flow state, and that ideally enhances therefore their learning and their well-being. And to do that, I'm looking at what are called the group flow triggers. So Keith Sawyer's identified 10 things that tend to, as it were, engender flow or bring out flow, elicit flow. So they include things like very close listening, blending egos, so no one's seeing their ego as much higher than another, equal participation, everyone's roughly level pegging, yes and. So from live improv, this idea is so not kind of just rejecting something when someone says it, but going, oh yes and. So in live improv, I don't know, someone might, in an improv scene, walk up to a bar and say, hey, I'd like to order a raw fish, and the barman, if you did that in a bar, the barman would be like, what? The idea is the barman will say, oh yes and, would you like salt with that? So obviously when we talk about that in a philosophy lesson, but if someone threw out some wild idea, as they often do in philosophy, they wouldn't just go, rubbish, let's move on. They go, oh, yes, and maybe we can connect that with the earlier argument that Ross made in response to Janet's point about this.
Yes.
Right? So these are some of the so-called group flow triggers that I'm trying to facilitate in philosophy teaching, and we'll see how that goes.
Really exciting. Yeah. What are you most excited about for this piece of research?
I'm most excited about kind of seeing groups of students, hopefully, in a kind of a group flow state. Seeing them, if I can, well, even if I don't get them into group, it's great watching students assess a philosophy, but if I can get them into a very high state of performance there and enjoyment, it's a beautiful thing to see. And then seeing the things they learn through that, the insights they have, the conclusions they reach, and asking them how much they enjoyed it as a result of that. Seeing asking them afterwards, because I'll do things like focus group sessions where I ask them about mental stuff, ask them what they enjoyed most and so on.
That's really great. That sounds really, really interesting and really exciting. And you're also looking at the future of education. You're editing a book for Oxford University Press. How's that going?
It's going very well, thanks. So I'm co-editing a book with my friend Dr. Christina Easton, who's a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University of Warwick. And it's called The Future of Education, Reimagining Its Aims and Responsibilities. It's coming out from Oxford University Press next year, 2023. We are honoured to have an amazing set of contributors to this in kind of three sections: aims, responsibilities, and future of education. And that responds to issues that have been brought about over the last few years that concern those three areas. So there's been, for example, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been heightened discussions of education aims. There's been so many because after schools closed, but there was a lot of pressure to reopen schools, and lots of arguments, we shouldn't be keeping schools closed. We should need to find a way to reopen them as soon as possible, in spite of the risks, many people argued. That raised questions about what is the aim of schooling here. And then when we're remotely educating students in schools, figure out what we should be focusing on. Again, many op-eds and articles are published on what the aims of education are, and some controversial claims were made, and there's been debates over whether the true purpose of education is to prepare a student for their future job, as I believe Gavin Williamson said in a speech July 2020. I might be misremembering that, but I believe that was one that was quite controversial that came out. It wouldn't be controversial to say that's an aim of education. The aim of education is to prepare a student to get a job, and a number of articles are published in response to that. Some of it is in response to those kinds of questions, and also then the responsibilities of education and what the future holds in light of what's happened in the pandemic. There's articles responding to issues raised by the Black Lives Matter movement, which, in conjunction with that and various other debates about things like decolonising curriculum and how that's best done. There are papers discussing the role of education within wider communities. What is the role of education in a kind of in relation to its place? And there's some very interesting research in that area. So, for example, Jeff Duncan Andrade, whom I have great respect for, he's an educator and a professor at the University of San Francisco, I believe, and he's his whole life also been an English teacher, and he set up a school called the Roses in Concrete School in Oakland, California. We also interviewed him recently for this podcast launching soon. He argues that the aim of education is youth wellness, by which he means it's kind of a certain conceptualization of flourishing, but his conception of youth wellness builds into it the relationship between the school and the community.
Yes.
Which I think is very interesting, and we can learn a lot from that in research on flourishing. There's some articles that talk about community engagement, widening the place of schools there. That's a few slides.
Fantastic. And which part of it do you think is going to be most impactful?
Oh wow, what a great question. What I would hope. It's a different question which part will be as to which part I hope will be. I hope the thing that will have most impact from that book will be seeing that education has broader aims that are extremely important other than preparing students for the workforce. While that is vital, I think it's dangerous to think of education as that being education's sole aim or even its primary aim, because it does foster, and it has fostered a utilitarian conception of what education is for, where students, and it's not their fault necessarily, because if that's the kind of narrative that's fed to them broadly by the culture in which they're living, by say a government, and then by their own parents, partly as a result of that, but also culture more broadly, and then by their peers, also by some of those teachers, they're school leaders. That can lead to a kind of a way of approaching education where it's like, why would I do this unless it's going to directly enhance my performance in the test, and unless that's going to directly enhance my chance of getting that job? You don't want students to think that way because, well, first, an education experience should be more than just performance in the test. But second, so much of education doesn't directly relate to a particular career, and yet is so valuable for your development. Reading the works of Shakespeare, if you tried to say, okay, this is how this is going to directly relate to that possible career you have in whatever it might be, it's very hard. but it's so important, right? Or engaging with contemporary literature that is of appeal to you and particularly pertinent to the time and the place in which you're living. And that's one of the reasons why the arts and humanities often suffer from this culture. And I'm a big defender of the role of the arts and humanities in education, their importance. for a kind of enriched, holistic education, not just in terms of satisfying the epistemic aims of education, but also the character aims, the civic aims. So what I hope emerges from this book is a wider understanding of the very important aims of education has, which include preparing students for the workforce, but also very important aims as well. What impact I think it will have, that's a really hard and good question. I think that the chapters that people will find most influential are those that respond to and offer kind of original insights and research on current areas in which there are crises, such as the kind of mental health crisis amongst young people and how education can best respond to that. How education can recover from the pandemic. How education needs to be broadened such that it isn't just, as it were, decolonized, but also addresses other concerns such as sexism in education in various curricula and so on, and how we can combat prejudice through education and in education. I think those chapters will be those that are received with most enthusiasm because of the time in which we're living. They're very live and important issues, but also because some of them will give direct practical advice, and here are some research-based areas.
And has much emerged yet, for example, from the chapter of the research on the responding to the mental health crisis? Because I know that's very much at the forefront of many people's minds.
The deadline for first drafts of chapters into June. So so far,
you gotta give predictions.
Yeah,
on
so
what
far, Christina and I have only reviewed excellent abstracts from excellent contributors. So I haven't yet read the chapters, so I can comment, because I haven't read the chapters not because I've been sitting around not reading them, it's because I haven't yet received them.
Yeah, fair enough.
Nothing wrong with that, because they haven't yet arrived. They're not supposed to arrive for another few months yet. So I can't say yet.
But definitely one for us to all look out for.
Please do, yeah, it comes out in 2023.
Fantastic. That's very exciting. And what would you say the aims of education are, if you were going to summarise it?
Right, so I think education has multiple aims. I think it has epistemic aims, advancing knowledge and understanding, and the cognitive skills, well, not just the cognitive skills, the virtues that support advancing knowledge and understanding, such as critical thinking skills. I think it's vital that education aims to develop those. Rationality, developing rationality amongst young people, and then related skills, which is the discernment and so on, right? But often these really fall under the bracket of critical thinking skills. Critical thinking, though, is best taught, and the research shows this, where the subject matter for it, comes from some area in which you're applying it. So where you're not just learning abstract applications of skills. So you can have very effective lessons on, what is a fallacy? Here's a straw man fallacy, right? Or a tu quoque fallacy, or an ad hominem fallacy, or something. And here's an example. Cool. But it's much more effective if you find some subject matter where that fallacy is demonstrated. You have to find it and identify what's wrong with it and why this is a problem, right? So the most effective way, I think, to teach critical thinking is to try. It's fine to have those independent critical thinking lessons where you're exploring it and you've got independent subject matter, and we do that at Sevenoaks. I teach it there. I've taught it for many years as a own standalone subject, and logic as well at university level. Very valuable to teach that an independent subject, of course, very important. But I think the most effective way to teach critical thinking is by embedding it with other subjects, and that's something I've done research on for a few years, on how you can best embed it in the context of teaching religious studies.
Yes.
So I used to teach philosophy and religious studies, and I had a problem with the idea that students didn't really grasp the difference between them because they were taught as one thing, right? And that's not the student's fault. It's more that you have, for example, A-level religious syllabi and religious studies syllabi, which include philosophy, but it's often, because they're merged together, often not clear what the difference is.
Yeah.
I called this kind of the conflation problem in the teaching of philosophy and religious studies. And so I wanted to find a way that you could teach them where they were complementing each other, but they weren't getting conflated. I thought the best way to do that was to take the subject matter from religious studies and
Yep.
apply what you're learning in critical thinking. So, for example, if you're learning about Aquinas' 5 ways, and he employs an argument that's a reductio ad absurdum, which is where you try to reduce a certain argument to an absurd conclusion to give a reason to reject it. He does this in his 3rd way, in his 3rd attempt to prove God's existence. You're learning about reductio ad absurdum in critical thinking lessons, then you're using Aquinas' 3rd way as a way of studying the application of that. Okay, so integrating it and embedding it. Anyway, it's a very roundabout way of answering these 2 questions. So education has epistemic aims, which include advancing knowledge and understanding and critical thinking skills. Thinking skills themselves involve development of rationality and discernment and so on. The best way to teach critical thinking skills is to embed them with other subjects. But you can also have those separate lessons, but you really want to also embed it. And you can do it, I think, in various subjects. I'll give you one example of religious studies. I would also argue that education has character education aims. The development of the virtues that foster good character in a broad sense. So that's going to involve with moral character. But it's also going to involve cognitive virtues, if you like, or intellectual virtues, like I mentioned, critical thinking skills. So they involve civic virtues. So a respect for and an understanding of why it's important to contribute towards the common good. For example, just an understanding of why it's really important to vote, why it's really bad just to abstain from voting unless you collectively form some protest to do this, in which case you would be trying to contribute to the common good through some stance you're collectively trying to have, which is that I won't bother voting, or why that teaches you to understand why that's not really a respectable thing to do, by developing civic virtues such that students can see this for themselves. And then, and here I borrow from the framework for character education that's published by the GP's Set of Character Virtues, 2017. They add a 4th category of performance or enabling virtues, such as resilience, grit. I think resilience is very important in education. I've done a lot of research on that. So those character education encompasses all those areas. Now, that will also involve kind of attempt to fulfill the moral and political aims of education. Political aims fitting in with civic aims, moral aims fitting in with character education aiming to foster good character. Does that exhaust all the aims of education? Epistemic, civic, political, moral, character? Yeah, I think I'd say, no, excuse me, of course. I would also argue that education has well-being aims, which are extremely important for flourishing. Yes. But as I've said, I think that the most effective way for those to be fulfilled is by integrating them with education epistemic. So I've quite broad conceptual education aims, which is, there's a whole spectrum of views of the aims of education. Some think education has no aims, it's called the no aims view. Some think the most important is the kind of orthodox view is that the primary or only major aim is the epistemic aims. I have this broad view of education.
Thank you so much. And just a final question for me. If you were going to give a teacher listening to this, or a parent, one piece of advice to improve the flourishing of either the young people they work with or their own children, what would that be?
Wow. What a great question again. Thank you. Give me a moment. I think it would be to see that well-being is something that can significantly enhance learning, and that learning is something that can significantly enhance well-being. And so a very effective thing you can do as a teacher is to try your best to support the well-being of your students, both as an aim in itself, but also as an aim that will directly support your aims as a teacher in the teaching of your subject, in supporting their learning, their intellectual development. That needn't be something additional that you do outside the classroom. that it can very much be part and parcel of what you're doing in the classroom. And as such, in that sense, it can enrich and enhance the practices that you regard to be extremely important, namely teaching and learning practices, things to which you're devoting your work and life.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Please can we stop the recording there, and we will then take any questions.